So Microsoft, anyway, so IBM said, we'll protect Linux. We're going to ship Linux. And you know what, Microsoft, you mess with Linux, you mess with us, which Microsoft can't do. So, but yeah, it's like the party could end, right? If they decide, I read somewhere that the Microsoft execs call it knifing the baby, killing Linux. So,
My goodness.
so I think, if we had massive adoption, and I think it's also a matter of, if this happened, it would happen quietly in the middle of the night, because not enough people understand what an outrage it would be, how unjust, and what a loss to all of us who use computers, which is all of us.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation. I mean, I'm learning all this as we go, and I think it's so important to get these conversations out there. So I don't know, they just really are bastards, aren't they? Just, I mean,
they're parasites.
Yeah, just like, it goes back to Plato's Republic, doesn't it? It's the same old dance. There's a group of people who think they can infringe and control others, who can't leave people alone. And there are others who just want to be left alone and want to be free. You know, this is a tech conversation, but it could apply to every aspect of all the conversations that we have in autonomy and in the freedom-minded community. It's unbelievable.
And I think there's something missing. Something feels wrong. I feel it start to crumble. Here it comes.
Listening to truthconduit.com with Chris McMillan.
So, I will express the tragedy going on in my head right now after I introduce you as, should I do it in a deep voice? Luis Palacios. And I need to introduce some kind of sound effect, So, this is episode 34 of truthconduit.com, and I'm with Luis Palacios. Luis Palacios is a season 1 graduate of autonomy. You have proven yourself to be extremely well knowledged in so many areas, scholarly areas, and historical, philosophical, and technical. Tonight's talk is very technical. And your day job, your night job is you are a freedom-minded member of the rebellion fighting against the galactic empire. Your day job during the day is you are an engineer. You've got a quote-unquote real job and a proper career in California. And I forget, what city in California are you in?
I'm in Oakland, California.
Yeah. Well, I know you've been giving these talks in autonomy about Linux, and I'd never heard of it. I thought Linux, what else? Linus, from Charlie Brown. What are you talking about? What is Linux? So yeah, here we are. I want to ask you questions about it. And the objective of the interview today is I want someone who's not familiar with Linux, like myself, to walk away with a clear idea of what it is and maybe whether or not they should start looking into it. And most questions I have for you are genuine. I do not know. When I heard your interview with Mike Nimitz, I really enjoyed it. And I just found myself grabbing the pen and paper. And I told myself, okay, I'm going to follow Mike's lead. I'm going to get Luis on for the similar talk because I know a lot of people, have got one foot in, one foot out about Linux. So, but here's my dilemma that I was mentioning to you earlier. It's Saturday night in Texas. It's 7 o'clock. So do I grab a coffee or do I grab a beer? I don't know. Can I mix them both can I mix them in the same cup and just knock them back? Would that be recommended?
I wouldn't recommend that, but I'll tell you, I started early today. So I had 2 Jamesons and then a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
And then some people are coming over later. So I think there might be more Jamesons
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
the
you're-
future. So I've sandwiched the two.
You're 2 hours ahead of me as well. You've got the, yeah. Very good. Well, Luis, I mean, you can imagine my questions are just softball pitches at you.
No, yeah.
What is Linux? What's all the hype about? Go for it.
Yeah, sure. And let me back up. I love this. I think my goal is to get more people to understand what Linux is. And I think intended audience are people that are not necessarily computer savvy or have given this a lot of thought. So Linux, what is it? It's an operating system. It runs on regular PCs. It is an operating system very much like Microsoft Windows or Apple OS X. It is created by a group of volunteers, and it's a culmination of a project called the GNU project, which was headed by Richard Stallman in the
How do you
early
spell
80s.
that?
So GNU is it's a recursive acronym, so it's nerd humor. There's a lot of acronyms. GNU, and it stands for GNU's Not Unix. Because Linux is very Unix-like. In fact, there's a lot of these recursive acronyms. So, and they've got a sense of humor. There's a lot of tongue-in-cheek nerd humor in this. So that's
the letter G actually is GNU.
GNU.
Okay.
So it's a Unix-like operating system. So it's Unix-like in the basic architecture of how it's put together. This was put together. It's basically what makes Linux unique is its software license. So when Richard Stallman set out to create a free operating system, and this is free as in freedom, not necessarily free as in free cost, the goal was to have something that would remain something that would be free and open to all. So they have a unique software license. The software license, basically, it only limits you in that you can't take this software, package it, and not share it openly, basically. So Linux is simultaneously an operating system, a philosophy, a unique software license. It's all those things. But for the uninitiated or for those curious, just think of it as an operating system. It's free. You can obtain it free of cost, but its most important freedom is that it's free as in freedom. And to understand how an operating system can be free as in freedom, we might have to get into how it's built a little bit. But I've been passionate about Linux ever since I found out it existed. I would say the biggest difference between Linux and other operating systems is that you have access to the source code. Source code is how you create a software program. So if you don't have access to the source code, you can't understand what the software does. You can't verify that it's doing what it claims to be doing. You can't study it. You can't modify it, and you can't freely share it. So I would say that's the biggest difference between Linux and Windows and Mac OS X, is that it's open. Anybody can study it and see what it's really doing and understand what it's really doing. And this is useful for a couple of reasons, right? Microsoft has been caught so many times not saying what they claim to be doing. The software doesn't do what it claims to do, or it does additional things. It sends your password somewhere else, or it's spying on you, or it's sharing your data. It's hard to do that with Linux. If somebody malicious, if Bill Gates wanted to get a hold of Linux, he would get caught almost immediately because of the nature of the operating system. Somebody would be like, hey, that's not, you say it does this, but I can tell that it doesn't. So yeah, I need to come up with better analogies for what it is. But basically, it is an operating system that can be audited by knowledgeable people. And I'm not a computer programmer. I've never gone through the source code myself, but I benefit from the fact that there's a community of people looking at it and poking at it. So that's Linux in a nutshell. It's a free operating system.
What year are we talking about when you're talking about Richard Stallman back in the day, getting it all set up? What's the time frame like?
That's a good question. I should have it clear in my mind. I think the GNU project started in 1983, but you can imagine it's a lot of effort to create an entire operating system from scratch. So I think the final piece was put in place, I want to say the early 90s, but I would have to double check that. The final piece that was put in place was the kernel. It's kind of the capstone of an operating system. The kernel is Linux. So the whole operating system is known as Linux. Though technically, in my opinion, it should be called the GNU operating system. But anyway, it was the last piece that fell in place. And the whole thing was named after the kernel, Linux.
What has been the response? You've been giving talks on Linux in the autonomy community. Is that still ongoing? And what's been the response like? What kind of feedback have you been getting on that?
It's been interesting. So I think autonomy attracted a bunch of like-minded people. So it turns out there's a lot of Linux users. My goal was to reach the masses. So I believe Linux is valuable and to anybody who uses a computer. They just don't know it yet. They haven't come up. So I'm trying to introduce the idea of Linux and get on board. You don't have to be a tech savvy person. If you can use Windows, you can use Linux, basically. So that I started off my lectures in autonomy, my presentations in autonomy with that in mind. I want to get all these people that are interested in freedom. First of all, I need to explain why, in order to be free, you need to use a free operating system, right? Especially as our lives become more computerized, we need to take control of this computing. That's what Linux represents. We own the computing. We control it. We control our machines. With Microsoft Windows, with Mac OS, the machines control you because you have no idea what it's really doing. So I started with that in mind. Turns out there's a lot of Linux savvy people. So that's who was showing up at the presentations. I envisioned it would be newbies interested. Turns out it was kind of more techie people that are already using Linux. So the reception has been good. It wasn't what I thought it would be.
I mean, I got to admit, I was intimidated because of my basic technical abilities. And so I kind of had an idea what it was about, but I was intimidated to go in because I thought it would all be over my head. But, I'm overcoming that scarcity mentality, which is why we're here. And I'm asking you questions about it and learning about it now. Better late than never.
Yeah, I'll be honest. Yeah, seriously. Linux in the beginning was really a techie plaything, I think. It used to be a little bit more intimidating. It really did but it's funny, it's been polished to the point where it's really like a pretty version of Windows that works better. It doesn't crash. There's no viruses in Linux, right? There's all these reasons to use it. So if you can use Windows, you can use Linux. I'll tell you what the biggest barrier is. The biggest barrier is that no one installs Windows, right? You buy a computer, it has it already installed. Linux doesn't come pre-installed in computers. So the biggest barrier is installing it. And even that's not difficult. They've made it very easy. But you're gonna have to roll up your sleeves, download some stuff, read a few things. And that's my goal. My first several presentations were just basically showing you how to install Linux and trying to dispel these myths. It's a pretty simple process. So
I mean, what is it? Is it a disk? Is it
okay?
Is it something like that? I mean, is it something you go and buy? Where do you get it?
Good question.
Good question. Where does one begin?
Yeah, good question. Good question. So Linux is a body of software that exists, in repositories throughout. What people have done is they've assembled something called distributions, Linux distributions. So some people have an idea of what an operating system should look like. That's the beauty of Linux. Somebody else thinks, no, it should look a little different. So they end up forming groups. So if you do a search online for Linux, what you'll end up coming across are what they call distributions. And they have names and they have their own marketing thing. So let's say for a beginner, I might recommend Linux Mint is what I've been recommending. There's others. Ubuntu is popular. I'm using Manjaro. So you go to the Manjaro website and what you do is you download a large file. It's an ISO. It's a disk image. It's a 2 gigabyte disk image. You download that. It's free. And then that disk image is a self-installing program, basically. You put that disk image on a thumb drive, Okay, and I provide instructions on how to do this. Is that pretty straightforward? You can find, in fact, there's a lot of instructions on how to do this online. But the basic process is that you download the ISO for your desired distribution, put it on a thumb drive, stick that thumb drive in the computer where you're going to install Linux. You boot the computer, and the Linux operating system runs from that thumb drive. So it basically boots into a fully functional operating system. It's actually phenomenal, right? Windows still can't do this, I don't think. I mean, and this is Linux for a long time. So as it's booting, it's configuring your hardware, and it figures it all out. And boom, you got a full Linux desktop. You can play with it, and within this fully functional Linux desktop, you just double click, and it'll install to your hard drive if you want to install it permanently. And most people play with it. It boots up. They decide that, okay, this isn't scary, and then you go ahead and install it, all from that thumb drive that that contains the ISO that you downloaded.
Do they take up a lot of space? I mean, would you need a pen drive with a lot of memory on it?
The short answer is yeah. Well, I don't know what's a lot. So basic, you're looking at 2 gigabytes. You need a 2 gigabyte thumb drive, which used to be a lot. But it's funny because it's changed over the years. When I first started using Linux, there were no thumb drives. It was all CDs. So it used to be a 650 megabyte file that you would burn to a CD, and you would boot the CD and run Linux that way. There are still some distributions that are tiny. They're a couple hundred megabytes. But most distributions that a new user would be interested in running, 2 gigabytes. You need a 2 gigabyte thumb drive, which at this point is also nothing.
Okay.
It's very small.
What are the costs like? It doesn't cost anything? I mean, it must cost nothing, not even the download, nothing. Okay.
Yeah, so it's curious. The way the software license is written, you can charge for the software if you wish.
Yeah.
But you always have to distribute the source code with it. So in practice, what a lot of distributions, they're assembled by users. There are people that are benefiting. They're benefiting from this thing that exists, right? So I'm getting this free operating system. They don't mind donating their time to assemble these things and create a website. And it typically gets monetized on the other end. So if you're a business that runs Linux, and a lot of businesses run Linux, Microsoft runs Linux because even Microsoft can't make Windows work, It's a lot of Microsoft servers run Linux because it's just better software. It's more stable, everything. So anyways, so at the other end, you have professional companies. Red Hat's the most famous example, but a lot of professionals make a handsome living maintaining Linux machines for people. So there's some incentive to provide it, but anyway, but it's free. So for a desktop user, it's totally free. There's no cost to you. You can always pay somebody if you want help, if you want somebody to install it. I mean, there's a lot of side hustles that happen, totally above board. But if you want to try it out, go download 3-4 different distros, see which one you like. And my goal, within autonomy, I think it's presentation 2 where I go over, it's either 1 or 2 where I go over the installation process. So you can just follow that or reach out to me. I mean, seriously, my dream is to get everybody running Linux.
So the process of switching over to Linux, it goes in increments. I mean, you don't have to go full on 100%. You can do it bit by bit until someone gets the hang of what they're doing. For example, you had recommended to me the Olive editor. Is that part of the Linux system?
Yeah.
See, I didn't realize that. But then,
So that's right. Olive is open source. It's a free software program. A lot of programs that you use on Windows are actually Linux apps that migrated over. Firefox, VLC, Audacity. They started off as Linux apps that are excellent due to the nature of the software.
Yeah. Firefox and Audacity were originally Linux.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
They're open source.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Firefox was the Linux web browser, right? But it was so good that it ended up being ported to Windows.
Was that just a backhanded business deal or what? Windows said, hey.
It has nothing to do with Windows. So it has everything to do with the open source law. It has to do more with Richard Stallman and his software license. It permits that. So look, the whole point of the reason it's called open source or free software is the source code has to be shared. You always have to share the source code. If you're a programmer with access to the source code, you can take that source code and quote unquote compile it. It's called compiling. So you compile it, and you end up with an executable binary. So even though it had been created for Linux, the hard work was done. A Windows developer, all they had to do was take the source code and compile it for Windows. And because it's open source, they're free to do so. And I'm sure that Firefox developers were just happy to have more users and a larger user base. So this was all the Mozilla Foundation. And anyway, so it'll kind of migrated over. So Microsoft doesn't yet, although I'm sure they will. They would love to block non-Microsoft applications from running on Microsoft Windows, right? And they've played those shenanigans before. So no, really, it's just the fact that anybody can take it. You can take it if you really wanted to. You could grab that source code and you could, do whatever you want with it. So you're already using a lot of open source programs, likely, So and Olive is a good example of that too.
What about LibreOffice? Would that be one?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, because I do use that.
Gap. Oh, good. Awesome. Yeah. How do you like it?
Oh, that's great. It's fine. Does everything that Microsoft Word would do that I need to do with it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So there was a need for an Office suite in Linux. So, they created LibreOffice, which has also been ported to Windows. So that's right. You can baby step. I think the biggest hurdle to adoption of Linux by a Windows user, here's the sticking point. If there's some piece of software that runs on Windows that you can't live without, it may not exist in Linux. There might be an alternative that's just as good, but if you spent 10 years becoming a pro with an Adobe suite, with Photoshop, say, even though there's a GIMP, which is feature complete and it can do anything Photoshop can do, if you've invested 10 years to Photoshop, and there's a lot to learn, right? Then Linux maybe it won't work for you because now you need to spend, another year getting up to speed on GIMP.
Well, that's another example that I also use is GIMP. I've used GIMP. I have a pretty basic skill level in it. I've used it to design a few T-shirts. So, but I didn't realize, I knew it was free. It's like, oh, okay, Photoshop you got to pay for. Oh, here's something called GIMP.
Right.
It's a no-brainer.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny. So in Windows, we've always had freeware. And there's a distinction between freeware. So that's free software, but the source code isn't shared. So you still don't know what the program's doing, It's stealing your credit card numbers or installing, who knows. So the GIMP and VLC and Firefox, it's open source, meaning, and you can go to the website and find a link to download the source code. If you're not a programmer, it may not mean anything to you, but technically, by the software license, they have to provide that. And that, I think that's the biggest distinction with free and open source software. They have to, so yeah, with the GIMP, it's free and open source.
What is the percentage, in your estimation, what is the percentage of people out there that actually are using Linux versus Microsoft?
So in the desktop space, the last number I saw might have been 3%, 4%, something like that. In the server space, it's less clear. I think Linux used to be the majority. So the backbone of the internet and the actual, enterprise class software was actually dominated by Unix and Linux. So I'm not really sure. Web serving might be 50-50. I honestly haven't looked at those numbers. So a big bulk of actual enterprise software is Linux because it works better. Desktops, not so much, right? Microsoft has a pretty good stranglehold on the desktop, but it's growing. It is growing. And for me, it seemed like it was time to try to help people along and push the message because it's time to just walk away from Windows.
What would happen if the whole world just suddenly switched over to Linux and moved everything over to Linux?
We'd have no more viruses. There would be no more spyware. We would stop funding an illegal monopoly that's held back computing. They've done nothing but harm computing, Microsoft, in my estimation. And I honestly, that's an opinion I can defend, I think. What else would happen? People would become more computer literate. See, that's the other thing that I realized when I started putting this together. Microsoft and even Apple, by closing people off from the operating system and saying, look, you can press these buttons, but you can't study or understand what's happening underneath the hood. They've promoted computer illiteracy. So one of the things that happens when you start using Linux is you start becoming more computer literate. You don't have to. You can just be a user and point and click and never worry about it. All you'll know is that your computer doesn't crash as often and you don't have viruses. But I think what happened to me slowly over time was I started kind of poking around the innards, because everything's documented, everything's explained, everything's accessible. So you start becoming more computer literate. So I think we would have an explosion of computer literacy. It would be good. It would be good. And then, man, I think about all these software licenses. Somewhere I saw every time you buy a computer, the Microsoft license is one of the most expensive components. And like for what, right? There's a bunch of volunteers can get together and create a better operating system than this mega corporation that charges a mint for something that is second rate. So yeah, there'd be more money in people's pockets. There'd be less viruses, less crashes. There's all these annoyances with Windows, forced upgrades, forced obsolescence. That doesn't exist in Linux because you control your computer, not some corporation remotely. So Richard Stallman describes it as either you're in control of your computer or the computer's in control of you, and there's no in between. It's one or the other, and only with Linux are you in control of the computer. And since we're on the topic, one of the most profound things that Richard Stallman has said, here's how he defines Linux. I love this definition because it's true. Linux is useful knowledge in a usable form. And
I like that.
It took me a long time to understand that.
Useful knowledge in a usable form. Sounds good to me.
That's Linux. That's Linux. And so anyway, it's not just for computer science majors anymore. I'm not a computer science major.
But just in case, my important question is, okay, someone is listening to this. They say, I want to get involved in Linux. What's the first step? What is the first thing they need to do when they want to start incorporating Linux systems over Microsoft?
Well, I guess I've got two questions. It depends on how they use their computer. They can baby step into it. And honestly, I think maybe the best way to do it is to download an ISO, put it on a thumb drive, boot Linux, and just start using it and see if it does.
Let me stop you there. For anyone who doesn't know, what's an ISO?
That's a good, yes, thank you. They call it an ISO file. It's a file extension. It's actually a disk image. So that's just the file extension for a disk image. They're always packaged as disk images. So you'll download this .iso file. It's a single 2 gigabyte file of thereabouts, 1.5, 2 gigabytes. And then you have to copy it in a special way. So you can't just copy it using your file manager. And there's these programs I recommend, Rufus, there's others. What you're doing is you're copying a disk image to a thumb. You're creating a bootable thumb drive with this disk image. So, so you do that, you stick it in your machine. And the other kind of tricky thing is you have to tell the machine, look, don't boot from the hard drive where Windows lives. Boot from the thumb drive that I just plugged into the USB drive. And in order to do that, you have to get into the BIOS. And we can get into that, I guess. But I would say that's the first step. Just boot it and then get it working. The way I set up my machine for a long time is something called dual boot. So you configure Linux. It gives you an option. So you boot Linux, you say you want to install it, and you tell Linux, okay, I want to install you on this computer. The installer gives you an option. Do you want to delete everything that's here and install Linux? Or I've detected an operating system here. There's some Windows thing here. Do you want Linux installed alongside it? So you can do that. So next time you turn on your computer, you get a little menu. Do you want to run Windows? Do you want to run Linux? So for a long time, that's what I did. It's called dual booting. So I would dual boot. So, if I needed to do my taxes and I had to use TurboTax, I would boot Windows and use TurboTax.
Don't do that, Luis. Don't
play video games.
No. Don't do your taxes. Taxation is theft, man.
It is. So there's no reason to use Windows, really.
Hold on, that's a whole other
For
topic. That's another interview, isn't it?
Right. So I would look into dual booting.
This is this is really cool, man. And I didn't realize I was already using aspects of Linux before. It never occurred to me to think, okay, why is GIMP available, or you could use that for free as opposed to Photoshop? It seems now we need to find an alternative to Zoom, because now that they're becoming more powerful, and because of, remember we were using them, that was our thing before COVID-19. We were using Zoom, there were no issues. Now that they have exploded onto the scene, they're going to start, like anything, it's going to just start getting crappier and crappier deal with it, because they can.
Right.
So I don't know. Do you know any alternatives to Zoom offhand, Linux based?
I don't know Linux based. I think Discord is open source, and it's got some of the similar capabilities. I think the problem with that too now is some of the infrastructure is not just software, right? So you need somebody who's willing to pay for servers and all this other stuff to manage this. I don't know if anybody's come up with a peer-to-peer, or I don't know, Chris. I actually haven't looked into it. I'm not sure. Because I was already running Linux, and I was just happy that there was a Zoom client on Linux, so I could, do all my autonomy stuff and not have to find a Windows machine,
Yeah.
But you're right. We're gonna have to find an alternative.
Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be a constant cat and mouse game. It always. That's what it is.
Yep.
With everything, not only in the tech world, but everything else. What about your talks? Are they still ongoing?
Yeah, I just did I did one last Thursday. I was thinking about taking a break. I need to recalibrate. I think.
Have you thought about packaging them maybe and offering a course?
Yeah, I need to figure out what to do with that. That's right. Yeah, so I thought maybe a course. I got a website, but I haven't done much with. It's called GNU Powered, and I thought about just maybe providing some of these free resources. Because look, my primary goal is to get as many people using Linux as possible, and I think my audience are just regular computer users. Explain what Linux is, explain the value, and then hold their hands through the installation process, because that's the only hurdle. Once you have it installed, honestly, it's just like Windows, but better. It's prettier, it's more stable, you can do more with it. You don't have to ever see a terminal command line, it's all point and click. But those are the hurdles. What happened with the presentations, and the reason I think I'm gonna take a break from them is the people that were showing up were tech savvy, and that's who was showing up to the live presentations. So I thought, well, I don't want to waste their time. So I switched the focus, and I started doing maybe more advanced topics. So I was talking about Linux administration, how to do administration of your box, basic scripting, which is kind of like I don't know, it's like low-level programming, simple programming, really simple programming, say. So I go, let me do some scripting to show what scripting is like and all this stuff. And because I was just trying to provide value to those that were showing up. But I thought, you know what? No, there's plenty of books on scripting and stuff. My goal is to get as many people on Linux as possible. So I think I need to recalibrate and figure out how I'm going to do that.
That seemed to work.
It works.
It's recording.
Okay.
That was very interesting, because that ties right into what we're talking about. That is an indicator of what was a good deal, becomes less and less because they can. Isn't that what Microsoft did or does constantly?
Yep. Oh yeah, they do it with file systems. They do it with file formats. They for instance, the file format, the FAT file format, which is what's used on USB drives and removable media. Microsoft said, yeah, we created it. It's our patent. Anybody can use it. And there was a huge uproar because, I don't know, 10 years ago, it was a while back, that Microsoft was thinking about licensing it. Once the whole world got to the point where they depended on this thing.
Yeah.
But there was a huge uproar. It's like, no, you promised you wouldn't. So yeah, that's what they do.
Would it be safe to say that Microsoft is evil? However you want to define that.
Look, yeah, I'll tell you what. Yes, I would say so. For one, it's an illegal monopoly in the sense that well, it was declared a legal monopoly, right? They don't provide any value. They've held back computing. If they didn't exist, computing, who knows where it would be? And a bunch of amateurs using their free time can produce a better product. So that tells you how broken the system is. Why are we paying through the nose to this thing that doesn't work very well? That, you know, there's a free alternative, and it's technically superior. I mean, Linux is technically superior. It's technically advanced. It does things that Windows can't do. It, you know, it's more secure. All these things. And I'll tell you the nature of them being closed source. I tell this story. I started using Linux because I was angry. I was angry at Microsoft. So back when I first started working, I was good friends with an IT guy. We became friends. He was the IT guy at the company. And one day he showed me, this was early Microsoft 97 or whatever, but I remember they had like a little box or a little button in the security settings that said, don't save my passwords or don't save my browsing history. I forget the details. But he showed me how you could navigate if you dropped into the command line to the DOS line in Windows. You could navigate and find a folder, and there's all your passwords and your browsing history. So there was like a little button that said, protect my privacy, that didn't do anything. And they were just counting on the fact that nobody was going to drop into the command line and find this folder. So who knows how many times, and this wasn't in the news, it didn't make the New York Times. I found about it from my, sure, yeah, so my IT guy friend shows me, you know, if you drop into the DOS, into the DOS prompt, you can navigate to a folder where Microsoft was saving your browsing history. I think it was browsing history. And so they had this button on the GUI, on the graphical user interface, that didn't do anything, right? It said, I'll protect your privacy, and it does nothing. They were just counting on the fact that nobody would go into the command line and find this folder, navigate to it. So they have a history of not operating with integrity, the leadership of that company. And they can get away with it because it's closed source. There's no way of auditing what the software is really doing, right? You just have to take it at their word that it does what you think it does. And then when I was getting ready for the presentation, if you look at the Windows 10 privacy policy, you can pull it up. It's a joke. The Windows 10 private policy says that something along, they can view and record any data that you create or transmit if they feel they can or have to, something like that. So the Windows 10 privacy policy basically says you have no privacy. So at least they used to pretend that, you know, they used to put a button that did nothing. We'll protect your privacy, press this button. Now they don't even, because, I mean, what are you going to do? You got to run Windows. And here's what really bothers me. All our data and our information is in a proprietary file format. It's in Microsoft Word. It's in Microsoft Excel. You know, you want to interface with the government. The forms are in Microsoft Word, Excel, you know, so they own our data. They own the file formats that our data's in. That bothered me. So I found this out from the IT guy, and that's when I started looking for an alternative. And I remember, I didn't know what Linux was. I didn't know the philosophy, but there was a free operating system that would run on the same computer that my Windows, you know, that was running Windows. So it started with that. So yes, I do think it's fair to say
When was
Microsoft
this?
evil.
When was this? I'm just
This
trying to
would have been late
imagine
90s.
Luis Palacios angry. It's very difficult for me to imagine you angry.
Oh no! Oh man, yeah, I was motivated, man. Yeah, no. So this would have been, I don't know, 99, maybe 98, 99, somewhere about there.
Yeah,
kind of in the early days.
the year of
Maybe
Office Space.
2000. Yeah, right. Yeah.
One of the greatest movies ever, along
Yes.
with
I didn't actually
Idiocracy.
ever-
I mean, seriously, Mike Judge was, I don't know who the guy is, but man, Idiocracy and Office Space, two of the most hard-hitting, he nailed it.
Yeah.
Why do you think why do you think so many people still don't know about Linux? I mean, I'd never heard of it till I met you. You start talking about it. Why do you think that is?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think part of it is just well, first of all, it's just brilliant marketing by Microsoft, and they have the market cornered. I'll tell you, people in software and kind of in the techie world, they've heard of Linux, so it's not completely unknown. I think even techie people, like, you know, the IT guys at work, they've heard of Linux. They just probably have never used it, and they don't know what it is. And I think it's a perception problem. that Linux is for techie geeks, or it's for system administrators, or it's for, because Linux runs on server. The server space is pretty much dominated by Unix and Linux. So I think there's this idea that, it's a bearded guy with a beanie top and, whatever, that's who runs Linux. So I think part of it is a perception problem. The other problem that has hurt Linux adoption is young kids that try new things. Games don't run Linux, right?
Mm.
So if you're 12 years old and you're playing whatever World of Warcraft, I don't even know what games they play now. I don't know what's popular. It doesn't run on Linux probably. And that's changed recently. It's starting to change. More and more AAA titles are available on Linux. Steam has a Linux client now. So anyways, I'm hopeful for the future. So there's now you can game on Linux, and all the benchmarks that I've seen, it's kind of amazing. Linux just mops the floor with Windows on the same hardware. It's just better quality software. So it's not only stable, no viruses, it takes better advantage of the hardware. So people that are interested in performance, kids, but they're interested in performance to get the most frames per second in their video game.
Can you do both? Like, could you have Windows and Linux on your computer?
Yep. So
And-
Linux.
Or can you just completely have Linux and do away with Microsoft?
So that's what I have. My last computer I bought, well, here's the tricky thing, right? It's almost impossible to buy a computer pre-built without Windows on it, right?
Yeah.
I don't know why that's not an option. You should be able to say, save, I want my $150 back. So I didn't want to pay the Microsoft computing tax. The only way to avoid the Microsoft computing tax was to build my own computer. So that already maybe, kind of narrows it down. Grandma's probably not going to go to Newegg and figure out which CPU goes which motherboard and which RAM she can use, right? So I took that effort. But yeah, I don't have Windows on this machine. My main machine, I don't need Windows for anything. I've got a work machine that I have to use that has Windows on it. So for work, I'm on Windows during the day. So yes, I can't think of anything in Windows that you can't do on Linux, right? I mean, like I said, there's specific software. Look, for us in autonomy, one of the sticking points was the brain. A lot of us used the brain software.
Yeah, the brain is great.
Released, yeah, they released a Linux client. So you can run the brain, but only version 8. You can't get the latest versions on Linux.
I only need version 8.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. So that's what I do. I bought version 10, I think, when I first found out about it. So it's installed on my Windows work machine, but that same license allows me to use version 8. So that's fine. I use version 8 on Linux and it does everything I need. So yes, so you can dual boot. So you can have both on the same machine, Windows and Linux, until you switch over completely.
Okay.
Or
the reason I'm asking
yeah.
is from a kid's point of view. I was, a teenager wanting to switch over. Could they get their cake and eat it too? Still be able to game using Windows, but also, okay. Very interesting.
In fact, that's what I used to do. So when I first switched over to Linux, I mean, I was in my 20s. I was going to LAN parties, and I was gaming, whatever I was doing back then. Or
Age of Empires, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that game. What else we used to do? StarCraft.
Okay.
Together, StarCraft and stuff. So that's what I would do. I would boot into Windows just for the games. So for me, Windows was just for games, and then for anything serious was Linux.
Very interesting. How would someone know if it's a Linux system or not? Like, I didn't know about GIMP, Firefox, VLC player. I didn't know those were Linux. Is there some master list of all the apps and everything that you can find that are for free for Linux? And also, while I'm thinking about it, an alternative to Excel. I'd like to get your thoughts on that as well.
Sure. Okay, so they're not. So Linux really refers to the operating system itself. So the category that the software falls under is really free software or open source software. I think Stallman prefers the term free software. So if you want to determine whether it's freeware, which at least it's free, but or if it's free software, is to look at the software license. So, and I often do, because I would rather only run free software. I want something that's audited and auditable, right? So I don't want to just run something, who knows what it's doing. So I always default to free software if I can. So look at the software license. You'll see there's a couple of really popular free software licenses. The first one is the GNU GPL, the GNU General Public License. So that's probably the most common one, also created by Stallman, right? I think that's why the guy was a visionary, and it bothers me that Linux is known as Linux and not as GNU OS. But anyway, so the other one is the MIT software license. So MIT, I don't really have this history together, but MIT played a big role in free software as well. So the MIT license is also a pretty common one. And it's often advertised. It's free and open source. It might be in the bottom, right, for the people that care. So I always look for that. So, and usually it's a stamp of quality. We didn't really get into that. There's reasons why free software is just better quality almost universally. And it has to do with how software is put together. So there's always an advantage to using free software. So that's how you would know. Look at the software license. And I forgot the second part of your question.
Any thoughts on alternatives to Excel? I have found
Excel,
something,
yeah.
but I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
So believe it or not, spreadsheets, there's a couple of free software spreadsheet alternatives, but you know, I've never had any problems with the LibreOffice suite, the Calc. I think it's called Calc. So you know, every time I have a spreadsheet need, I use Calc from LibreOffice or
Cal, like COW, Cal?
CALC, I think it's what it's called.
Oh, okay.
I think that's the name. I could be wrong, but it's bundled together. So you know, the LibreOffice includes like a word processor, but it also includes a presentation. So that's why slides for autonomy were done with LibreOffice. The present, I forget what it's called.
Yeah.
But it also has a spreadsheet. And you know what? I actually got curious, and I think even the spreadsheet can do more accurate calculations than Excel. I mean, you're talking about like huge numbers with like, you know, 10 digits after the decimal point. I saw somewhere where they were doing some calculations to really stress the systems.
On just LibreOffice, on their...
Yeah.
Huh.
So it's a whole suite. So, you know, maybe you only downloaded the word processor, but it's a full suite. So there's a basic drawing program, there's a spreadsheet program, there's a presentation program, and then the word processor.
I have found something called CryptoPad.fr. Have you heard of that?
Never, no. That's interesting. CryptoPad.
Yeah, it's almost exactly like Excel.
Okay.
And it's free. You just download it and you create a password. So you and other people, all they need is the link, the password, and you can all go in and work on it at the same time. I don't know much about it. I don't know how secure it is or who owns it or much about it. I don't know, but.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, that's cool. You can share it, right? So you can kind of, what do they call that? Yeah, you know, you can share it with people.
Yeah,
but
Excel is amazing. Excel is it's Jack Spirko's always saying it should be a life skill. Teach your kids to use Excel. Yeah. He reckoned the world would be a better place if people learned to use Excel, like a high school graduate considering going into college, or someone thinking about buying a new car. If you are skilled in Excel and actually know how to punch in the actual numbers, it would it would get you a better deal buying a car, and it would make you never go to college when you realize what you're actually paying for and how much each class, if you had to pay in cash at the beginning of every class, might make you, I don't know. Excel is a weapon to be, it's a tool to be reckoned with if you properly.
Yeah, so during one of the presentations, I think when I was going over Linux alternatives to software that how to be productive in Linux, I think is what I called it. I found the most complicated, convoluted Excel spreadsheet I can find online. And it was actually an engineering spreadsheet. So, it had beam bending engineering formulas. So, it had the different ways you can load a beam. And, you can punch in, put a load here and a load here or whatever. And it would actually, Excel spreadsheet would draw the load diagram, and it would actually create these animations showing you how the stresses were distributed on the beam and stuff. And I opened it up using LibreOffice, and it opened it up and it ran this stupendously complicated Excel spreadsheet just fine. So well, one, to your point, you can literally do engineering calculations on it, structural engineering, beam bending equations, right? And then two, honestly, the LibreOffice handled it just fine. It opened it and yeah, the animations worked, and you could do the beam bending and stuff. So yeah, it's used in engineering. It's an engineering tool. Man, we use it a lot in the office.
What kind of engineer are you again?
So I'm a mechanical engineer, but I work in a structural engineering firm. So I'm surrounded by structural. The joke in the office is that I'm the mechanical department.
Yeah.
Kind of the lone wolf.
Structural engineering. That could lead us off on a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But I won't go there. Yeah. I think that topic's been well worn out in many other areas. But here's another question I have. Linux is out there, open source. Is there anything equivalent to Linux? Now, my reaction would be to say, is there a competitor to Linux? But it's not a for-profit kind of thing. But do you know what I mean? Is there something, if Linux and everything involved around Linux disappeared, is there something else to fill that gap?
Yeah, it's an interesting history. So, well, first of all, Linux is like a whole ecosystem in and of itself. So, like I said, there's different distributions. So there isn't really a monolithic operating system. Really, what we have is distributions that run Linux. So, and there's a website called DistroWatch. You can go to distrowatch.org or .com, I forget. And it lists the 100 most popular Linux distributions, right? So I don't know how many distributions exist, but I know it's more than 100 because they're the most popular 100. Now, if Linux itself would disappear, and it's not out of the question, Microsoft has talked about it. In fact, IBM intervened in the early days. Microsoft, basically what they can do is they can just legislate Linux out of existence, and they threaten to do so. Anyway, so it could happen. There's something called FreeBSD. So it's similar to Linux in that it's a similar development process. It's also open source, but it's actually based on an old form of Unix. I think it's based on a Berkeley Unix developed in the 70s. I don't know the timeline, I shouldn't say, but it's FreeBSD, and maybe that's the biggest competitor in Linux. If you're really, really cool, you run FreeBSD because it's even more obscure than Linux, right? Those Linux, it's becoming too mainstream, right, and passe. So if you're really a neckbeard, FreeBSD,
smoking joints and using FreeBSD, and what kind of music do we have on in the background to use it?
I don't know what those guys listen to.
That is good to know, and that does lead to another question. What kind of threats are there out there against Linux? I mean, I suppose it's constantly. It kind of is on a small scale, the fight against what's going on the bigger scale. It's a small battle in this war against freedom.
Right.
And Linux is. What do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think it absolutely is, right? So I think, so Richard Stallman, let me back up. So Richard Stallman started the GNU project and all these things that happened. The other thing that he's responsible for is the Free Software Foundation. And they fight for your digital rights. They raise money. They fight for, net neutrality, whatever, these things. Population free unless the software that it uses is free. Something, I've just butchered it, but that's the message. And I thought,
that's okay, Luis, because it got choppy there. Whatever you said, you just butchered. It did. So you said Richard Stallman. The last thing you said before it cut off was the backup. So, Richard Stallman was fighting for net neutrality.
So he started the GNU project. So the other thing that he's responsible for is the Free Software Foundation. So they fight for all your digital rights, privacy, the right to have encryption, which is also under attack. The U.S. government has tried to legislate that away and make it illegal for you to encrypt your data. So the Free Software Foundation is out there fighting this stuff. So Richard Stallman, I want to shake that guy's hand, right?
Is he still alive?
Yeah, he's still definitely very much alive. the tagline of the Free Software Foundation is something along the lines of, you know, a population can't be free unless the software it uses is free, something like that. That's the gist. It's better stated, but I don't think it's an exaggeration. I think it's literally true. The threats to Linux are copyright infringement claims. So Linux has been written from scratch, right? So there can't be any claims that they stole stuff. But it's a dirty secret in Silicon Valley that, well, the patent system is broken. It's being abused. You can patent anything. So the big players, IBM, Microsoft, Hitachi, all these guys, Samsung, they've got ridiculous patents that should never have been granted. It is technically, I think literally impossible for you and I to do anything innovative with a computer without infringing 1 million patents held by these companies. They call them war chests. That's how they defend each other, defend themselves. So if IBM wants to do something, they're probably infringing on 300 bogus Microsoft patents. But if Microsoft comes after them, they can go right back, because Microsoft, they haven't invented anything. They're infringing on maybe 1 million IBM patents, right? I heard somewhere that IBM has a patent on information displayed on a screen, right? That should never have been so you literally can't do anything. So
that's like trying to get a patent on sunlight.
Yeah, right. No, and I'll be honest with you, I don't think software should be patentable. That was a mistake, right? We agreed a long time ago that you couldn't patent math. You can't patent a mathematical formula. We decided that made no sense and it was counterproductive. But so it's hard to draw a distinction between computer code and a formula, right? It's not that different. Anyway, so that was probably a big mistake. They never should have done it, but they did. So what happened with Linux in the late 90s, I remember watching this with anticipation because Microsoft was, I think they were already getting ready to sue and make Linux illegal because when IBM stepped in and said, we'll protect Linux. So Linux was a lot, because IBM realized that they make a lot of money selling really expensive equipment that runs Linux. So IBM became a champion of Linux. They were putting it in their servers. They realized, IBM, that the money's not in the software. See, if Microsoft didn't have illegal monopoly, it's an aberration and it shouldn't exist. There's no money in software because there's almost no value in software, really. There shouldn't be. The value is in services and in the hardware. So IBM will send you this really expensive computer. And by the way, we can maintain it for you and it's going to cost you a lot. But it will never go down. It'll be backed up, uptime forever. The services, we'll create custom code for you. We'll create, in IBM, the model before Microsoft came in and kind of broke everything, the operating system was always free. It's ridiculous that we pay money for the operating system. The computer's not useful without it, right? So IBM would sell a computer, that was included in the cost, right? It was just, you buy a mainframe from IBM. It would have a programming language built in, the applications you needed built in, the operating system obviously built in. So Microsoft, anyway, so IBM said, we'll protect Linux. We're going to ship Linux. And you know what, Microsoft, you mess with Linux, you mess with us, which Microsoft can't do. So, but yeah, it's like the party could end, right? If they decide, I read somewhere that the Microsoft execs call it knifing the baby, killing Linux. So,
my goodness.
So I think, if we had massive adoption, and I think it's also a matter of, if this happened, it would happen quietly in the middle of the night because not enough people understand what an outrage it would be, how unjust, and what a loss to all of us who use computers, which is all of us.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation. I mean, I'm learning all this as we go, and I think it's so important to get these conversations out there. So I don't know, they just really are bastards, aren't they? Just, I mean,
they're parasites.
Yeah, just like, it goes back to Plato's Republic, doesn't it? It's the same old dance. There's a group of people who think they can infringe and control others, who can't leave people alone. And there are others who just want to be left alone and want to be free. You know, this is a tech conversation, but it could apply to every aspect of all the conversations that we have in autonomy and in the freedom-minded community. It's unbelievable. if more and more people adopt Linux, do you think that would make it more likely that they might start to attack it, or less likely, or what?
You know, I'm not really sure. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure what their business models are like going forward. But I imagine, yeah, if they feel threatened by Linux, there might be more of a need to go after it. I don't know if they really can.
Yeah,
As long as there's like
you
as
know?
long as IBM or somebody like IBM has a need to keep Linux alive.
Yeah,
And I don't know how the world works at those levels, right? I don't know if IBM would really let Microsoft. I don't know if they go to the same parties. I don't know if they hang out. I don't, you know, I
yeah.
don't know if they co-own each other.
I mean,
But I would like to believe that IBM would be like, fine, Microsoft, you were run, you did nothing but, you know, pee in the punch bowl. You've provided no value. You've just been a leech financially. You should cease to exist and just let them dry up and wither away.
yeah.
I would like to think that, but I honestly don't know. But either way, you know, we won't find out until we get more people using Linux. And I think I think, you know, look, here was my nightmare when this was happening, and this used to keep me out. I used to just sit there shaking my fists at the sky, right? When it wasn't clear that Linux would continue to exist, before IBM stepped in and said, no, we'll protect Linux. Computing was going to become synonymous with Microsoft. That's what I feared, right? So no closed. Right? Use these companies that run Microsoft, and only Microsoft engineers know what's really happening, how to build an operating system, you know, because that would be the only operating system. It would just be it would be synonymous, like BIM, like you know, I'm trying to think the example. I can't think of it now. Where you know, a certain brand becomes synonymous with a product.
Yeah. But what you're talking about is, you know, if this was politics we're talking about dictatorship. You know, if it's a metaphorical dictatorship in the tech world.
Yeah.
And
look,
of course, that's what they will want. Of course, that's what they're going to go for. So thank goodness for the free market. I mean, I'm not a fan of IBM, but I'm glad they're there to keep Microsoft in check. And what about
IBM was
Dell?
IBM was the original evil corporation. So you know, to be clear.
What about the other big companies? I mean, there's Dell. I mean, there's what are the other big companies that kind of are involved? Who are the other supporters of Linux, if any?
I'm sure there's others that just benefit. You know, if you're not selling software but selling hardware, you know, you're kind of passing off the development costs. You know, you're distributing it. I don't know who the other big players are, honestly. I mean,
so is Richard Stallman really the only face of the GNU of Linux out there? I mean, because it's open source, it's decentralized, which is the way the whole world should be, in my opinion. But the disadvantage of that is there's no one or two, you know, sometimes maybe you do need a bit of centralization to rise up and fight against any threat. I don't know.
No, so unfortunately, Richard Stallman is kind of the forgotten figure in all of this. The figurehead for Linux is a guy named Linus Torvalds. That's
whoa. His name is Linus.
His name is Linus.
His name is Linus.
His name is Linus, yeah. So that's where Linux gets its name. So, which I think is, and it's unfortunate because, first of all, Linus gets all the credit that Richard Stallman deserves. Linus created a small piece of it, whereas Richard Stallman created a movement, an operating system, an actual software license, and Richard Stallman was based just on principle. And believe it or not, that's what turns people off. A lot of people in the techie world roll their eyes at Richard Stallman because he's always going on about freedom, right? And if you don't value it, it's just annoying, right? So they think of Richard Stallman as we just
slavery?
Forget about this
you know, I mean, I don't understand that. How can you roll your eyes at freedom?
Yeah.
What are these freaks?
Right. No, they just don't value it, right? They just think they don't see that aspect for it. For me, the important thing about Linux is the freedom part of it, right?
Yeah.
But for other people, it's just, it's powerful software and, you know, it's free, that's cool, and pay for it. And Linus is more corporate friendly. So he says the right things. I've never heard him say anything about freedom or principles. And that's all Richard Stallman talks about. So Richard Stallman has been kind of pushed to the side. So honestly, if you look at mainstream news or mainstream, even tech news, you'll see interviews with Linus. asking him about his leadership in the movement and having created an operating system, which he did not do. And what bothers me is he never corrects them. I've never heard Linus correct them and say, look, I'm just responsible for like the kernel, right? And there's this operating system and movement that I had nothing to do with. If Linus Torvalds had never been born, we would still have Linux. It would just be called something else.
Yeah.
If
The
Richard
kernel,
Stallman had
just to
never been
remind people, the kernel was the final step, was it the late
Right.
90s, that completed the whole Linux
Right.
project?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. So Stallman working feverishly to build this entire thing, you know, and you know, it's this huge structure, right, to create the operating system. It's just the capstone, you know, it's the kernel. And look, people that are technically minded might object, because if you're a computer science geek who designs operating systems, yeah, okay, the kernel is considered a very important, it's kind of the engine, say. It's the engine of the operating system. But look, you don't interface with Linux when you're using it. You don't even know it's there. We could find another kernel, drop it in, wouldn't matter, right? It would have zero effect. So, you know, I guess to give Linus his due, but he didn't even create it. So what happened is Linus was trying to create a kernel, and you know, and he got something that kind of half worked, and then he released it, and it was a community in this open source way, which is how things work, that kind of fixed it. And you know, so really he didn't even really create it. I would say, if we're going to give him credit, it would be for managing a small piece of this thing, but he gets credit for the whole thing. So I'm not a fan of Linus. This is a minority opinion in the free software movement. Richard Stallman's a quirky guy. He literally fits the bill. He's got a beard. He's a little nasally.
I'd like to know what kind of music he listens to.
You might know, yeah. He's got a blog, you know, and
really,
you know,
so these guys are still out there. I would be very interested to follow them. I suppose they're on Twitter, on social media, to get their take on this story as it develops. Because I have a feeling Linux is about to start growing a lot. I mean,
I hope so. Yeah.
How can it not? How can it not? Because it's like, once you learn about it, how can you ignore that? It's a good idea, and good ideas sell themselves.
Right. Yeah, you know, it's funny. That was my email signature for a long time. Was something like, and I'm going to butcher this too. Standing armies have no power against an idea whose time has come, something like that. And I just meant it in the context of Linux, right? It's like, this is just too good of an idea, you know? I don't care how powerful Microsoft is. This has to go forward. Well, we'll see. I mean, Richard Stallman, he has no Facebook account because he thinks social media is evil, right? For the same reasons.
And he's right.
And so it's kind of funny. You can find lectures that he does, and he does a very good job, an eloquent job of describing technology to non-techie people, and he's still just selling the message of freedom. And then you can find a lot of interviews of Linus getting celebrated for doing stuff he didn't do. So I don't think I've ever really found Linus said anything meaningful. But Richard Stallman's kind of an interesting guy to listen to.
What's the dynamic between Stallman and Linus? I mean,
I don't know that they interact a lot, honestly. Like I said, in my estimation, Stallman has been almost pushed to the side. So I don't think I've ever seen them in the same room even. Are
they both California, Silicon Valley guys, or what?
No. Stallman is East Coast, Massachusetts. He graduated Harvard, and then he was working at the MIT Media Lab when all this was happening. So when he created Linux, or the GNU operating system, or he started the GNU project, he was at MIT. And then Stallman is in Europe. He's from Finland.
Yeah, very good.
So yeah, I don't even know that he might be stateside now. I don't know.
But is he American?
Stallman is. Linus isn't.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. This is so much information, Luis.
Yeah. I know.
So what you're doing, I've got a problem. I have a bone to pick with you.
Sure.
You know, now I'm learning about Linux and all that. Now, obviously, that's going to be another thing on my to-do list.
Sure.
You know, when I heard your interview with Mike Nimitz for Leadership, Ethics, and Organization podcast, and it was Tyler played it on Autonomy Radio, and I was blown away because I know you had been giving the lectures, and I was intimidated to go in for reasons that you mentioned, especially once it got, I saw the announcement, it got very techie, and I said, well, all right, you know, what is this? But just seeing the conversations in Discord going on, I started to get the idea. Once I realized what it is, you know, I thought, okay, I am going to learn more about this. So, you know, I'm glad I finally got you on to do this. I think it's fantastic. It's just another, it's kind of like this, it kind of ties into my previous episode with Lisa Manfredi, how, you know, using whole life insurance as an alternative to being your own banker. It's just one of those things that not a whole lot of people know about, but it's self-empowering, it's decentralized, it's freedom, you know, and that's what we're trying to do, is just get the word out, because for obvious reasons. Yeah.
You know, you're right. And it's funny. I mean, look, our elections are being computerized. Our banking is computerized. We may have digital money. Hell, if we don't even understand how computers work, we stand no chance, right? So I think it's going to become increasingly important in a more computerized world to have a foothold, right? This should be our birthright, right? What John Taylor Gatto used to say. But even this, you know, so.
Luckily, if we do go back to the Stone Age, Luis, you and I do have clear memories of what it was like before the internet. We would be all right, I think, you know, going back, doing it old school. But a lot of these younger people, I don't know.
No, it's true, man. We lose the internet here, and it's a calamity. My 6-year-old doesn't know what to do.
I remember in 1997, this is like me going, when I were in my day, 1997, when I first moved to Madrid, you and I have talked about Spain. I literally would walk 20 minutes to an internet cafe, and then I would wait another 20 minutes for my turn to get about 30 minutes to check my email, you know? It was good times. Well, Luis, I'm out of questions. I think we should probably, this is a good point to wrap up. Do you have any other final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, the only thing I'm going to keep working at, I'm going to refocus my efforts on reaching out to newbies. I think that's where I want to go, not to the techie minded, but so any feedback, you know, not necessarily here, but, you know, at any time, what can I do to make this less scary, or what pain points people have? If anybody from Autonomy is listening, it would actually help me if you reach out with questions. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to tailor my message. And then I want to take it outside of Autonomy, and just try to reach as many people and just float it out there. You know, what it is, how to install it, and why you should consider it. I think that's what I'm going to focus on.
Fantastic. Luis Palacios, thank you very much.
No, my pleasure, man. It was an honor to be here. It was fun.
All right.
Yeah, I've got a friend in Jesus Christ. I've got a friend in Jesus Christ, and Krishna and Buddha and my